Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I am Christina Ewig. I am the director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. The Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy was founded in 1985. Guess what? That's our 40th anniversary this year. So, thank you. We were founded by Arvon Fraser, who was a human rights advocate, very engaged in women in politics, also locally in Minneapolis. So she was a practitioner, and she founded in conjunction with Barbara Nelson, who was a scholar, academic, professor here at the Humphrey School. And that's still what we try to do in the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy, is balance practice and scholarship together. We're the first center in the United States located, a first center dedicated to women, gender, and public policy, located in a comprehensive policy school. Our mission is to illuminate gender-based disparities through research, teaching, and public engagement, and identify solutions to those disparities. We take an intersectional lens. We take a holistic lens, which in part means, to us, gender is not a binary. It also means that gender impacts all aspects of our social fabric. And we also are very dedicated to public engagement. So this event marks our center's commemoration of International Women's Day, which is on Saturday. We didn't want to bring you here on Saturday, and it's spring break, so we thought Thursday might be a safe day to do this. International Women's Day was first established in 1908 to commemorate the strike of garment workers in New York City that marched. 15,000 women marched for shorter working hours, better conditions, and voting rights. So since that time, International Women's Day has become celebrated around the world, across the globe, oftentimes with more enthusiasm in other parts of the world than in the United States, but as a day of protest, a day of action, a day of commemoration to decades of organizing by women across the world. So each year we take a little bit of a different angle on International Women's Day, and this year we teamed up with the Charles Babbage Institute on Computing, Information, and Culture. We decided to bring technology into focus, and that therefore led to this partnership for today's event. It seems like an apropos moment to be looking at the impacts of technology, how it has gendered impacts, racialized impacts, but also we were really interested in how there can be feminist resistance to some of the negative impacts of technology and how we might reshape technology in more positive ways. So, before we start the program, I want to thank our sponsors. We have a number of different sponsors whose financial help has helped us to bring this event to you. The Department of Anthropology, RIDGES, the Institute for Race, Indigeneity, Disability, Gender, and Sexuality, the Women's Center, and the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change. Youngmin Chu, who is a PhD student in public affairs here at the Humphrey School, will be introducing our speaker. But before she does, my colleague Jeffrey Yost, professor and director of the Charles Babbage Institute, is going to give a little bit of background on the Babbage Institute and some short framing remarks on technology, our theme of the evening. Keep in mind that after our speaker, we'll have a moderated discussion. I'll be moderating it. I have a few questions ready, but it will be open mic. We'll have mics circulating in the audience. So keep your questions in mind for the question and answer that follows. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Yost.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. It's great to be here today, and we're so thrilled to have a lecture by Professor Anita Say Chan, and terrific to partner with the Center for Women, Gender, and Public Policy in the Humphrey School. So I'll provide a little bit of background on CBI and talk about some common themes we have at CBI with the particular talk today. Women and gender studies in technology is a major part of our research at CBI and has been for about a decade at least. And it's also important to research we facilitate globally as a leading archive. Gender in software and services has been part of my own research for about a decade. And in addition to directing CBI, I'm a research professor in the history of science, technology, and medicine at the University of Minnesota, and that's in the College of Science and Engineering. And CBI is a partnership between that college and in that program, HSTM, and university libraries. So we have both research and we have archives functions. CBI is a leading interdisciplinary research center and archives. Our mission is to conduct and foster research on the digital world. And we do that through publishing books and articles. We provide editorial leadership. I have a Johns Hopkins University Press book series, Computing and Culture, that I co-lead with University of California, Davis, Professor Gerardo Candias. And I'm also co-editor-in-chief of the journal Interfaces, Essays and Reviews in Computing and Culture. So we like to help authors and work with authors in developing their scholarship. CBI has incredible doctoral fellows, like our current Tomasz Fellow, Harvard University's Aaron Gluck-Thaler, and CBI's current interdisciplinary doctoral fellow from the Humphrey School, Youngmin Chu. We have senior fellows, top global scholars in sociology, anthropology, media studies, and history of technology. We are a leading archive center, really the leading archive center on information technology in the entire world. We have 325 well-selected archival collections, One of our largest collections at 600 boxes is the Jean Sammet papers. And Jean was the first woman Association for Computing Machinery president. She was a longtime IBMer. And prior to that, she was one of the leaders in developing the programming language COBOL, which has had a 60-plus year existence and is still used on some legacy systems. We have digital archives with the paper records. If you stacked all of them up, it would be more than 1.5 miles high. So we have very extensive collections. We have 175,000 photographs. Most important books and articles in documentaries on information technology history use our resources. And the physical collections are housed 85 feet underground in climate-controlled caverns. You see the image there that go 30 feet high. And there's 2 football fields worth of space underneath Anderson Library. So the footprint of the exterior of the building is much smaller than the underground portion where the archives are. We also have a leading oral history program, and that, like the archival collecting, began at the very start of the Institute almost 50 years ago. And we have full text edited transcripts of over 500 oral histories that are available online. And we've especially targeted interviewing women programmers, women computer scientists, and women entrepreneurs in the past decade plus. Our projects and events in the past half decade are very much in line with today's talk by Professor Chan. In 2019, I conceived of Just Code partnering a major CBI event with the University of California, Davis STS professor Gerardo Condias. And with Just Code, we recognize that both software code, as well as codes of law, culture, and practice, were amplifying power imbalances and societal inequalities. As such, or as tech systems and AI become more pervasive, to have justice in the world really requires Just Code. We held a 2-day interdisciplinary Just Code conference in 2020. COVID forced the planned physical event online. And we had 345 people join us over 2 days from 30 different countries. The book from this event, which includes some select papers as well as other recruited chapters, will be out in September 2025 within our Johns Hopkins University Press Computing and Culture series. After Just Code, we continued the momentum with a 3-year CBI-NSF oral history project on privacy and surveillance. And in 2023, we had a follow-on major symposium, Automation by Design. Essentially, it was focused on AI, but we used the term automation as we felt it was more apropos. Artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor is it intelligent. It involves extensive human labor behind the scenes, and it is not intelligent in any human-like sense of intelligence. It's mathematics and pattern recognition and prediction, and with large language models, is especially decontextualized and thus socially but not existentially dangerous. 19 scholars contributed amazing chapters to Just Code, among them Harvard sociologist Ya-Wen Lee, Cornell information scientist Gilly Vadan, and Simon Fraser University historian Stephanie Dick. Stephanie Dick wrote on the standard head for facial recognition, the mathematical mapping of a human head. And it is a white male head trained on white male head photographs. Mathematician Woody Bledsoe led this work in the mid-1960s. It was funded by the CIA. And in law enforcement today, facial recognition systems draw upon Bledsoe's work. These systems have proven to be highly discriminatory and racially biased in practice. In Just Code, I wrote on AI and neural nets for the epilogue, and I also did a chapter on women IBM system services workers in punch card tabulation and computer programming from the 1930s into the 1960s. And this group of women field services tech workers set the model for systems engineering at IBM. But as the job class of systems engineers was professionalized and elevated in the 60s and beyond, it was gendered male, and they were pushed aside largely. More generally, with women in computing, in the mid-1980s, women were 38% of computer science majors. Now women make up only 18% of computer science majors. In other professions, gender gaps have contracted. In computing, software, and AI, they have widened. There's been anemic regulation of the now multi-trillion-dollar IT giants. Corporatism is reigning supreme. Never has an industry been so powerful. 6 IT giants are 1/3 of the S&P 500 in capitalization. At their peak, big tobacco, big pharma, and big oil were not even close. They weren't even half that. Silicon Valley had its birth in Shockley Semiconductor, and its descendant Fairchild Semiconductor, and the latter's Fairchildren, or Intel, National Semiconductor, and Advanced Micro Devices. Nobel laureate in physics and founder and CEO of Shockley Semiconductor, William Shockley, was a major advocate of eugenics. At Stanford University, psychologist Louis Terman of Stanford Binet IQ test fame was an intellectual leader of eugenics on the farm, Stanford's common nickname. Ideas from this intellectual farm have impacted the world, fueling eugenics thought. And eugenics in Silicon Valley has long been a prominent ideology. Before Anita Chan's incredible new book, this was known more anecdotally by historians such as me. Her book monumentally achieves, through deep research and astute analysis, in bringing these strands together to provide rich and powerful understanding. The BIPOC community, and especially women within it, have been targeted by creators and users of IT systems. They've also been leaders in the resistance, as Professor Chan will discuss. As information scholar Jeffrey Bowker emphasizes, data is never raw. It always has context. Professor Anita Chan has brilliantly examined the long history of how, at the hands of IT leaders, data has been and is predatory. I will now turn things over to Youngmin Chu.
Thank you, Professor Yost and Professor Ewig. So hello, everyone. My name is Youngmin Chu. I'm a PhD candidate here at Humphrey and a research fellow at the Charles Babbage Institute. I am honored to introduce today's speaker, Professor Anita Say Chan. Professor Chan is a scholar and educator dedicated to feminist and decolonial approaches to technology. She earned her PhD from MIT and is currently an associate professor in the School of Information Science and the Department of Media and Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Professor Chan's research explores how data and technology shape power dynamics, particularly focusing on marginalized communities. Professor Chan's first book, Networking Peripheries, Technological Futures and the Myth of Digital Universalism, was published in 2014 and explored alternative digital culture among artisans, indigenous activists, and rural educators in Peru. She has also published numerous articles and books, book chapters in English and Spanish on topics ranging from community data initiatives to educational technology. Through her work, Professor Chan advocates for more inclusive, ethical, and community-centered approaches to data governance. Professor Chan has just published a timely and groundbreaking book, Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future. The book examines the historical ties between eugenics and contemporary data practices in the tech industry. And it will be the focus of her work, of her talk today. And please join me in welcoming Professor Anita Say Chan.
Thank you, Youngmin, and thank you, Christina and Jeffrey, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, too, to the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy and the Charles Babbage Institute of Computing, Information, and Culture for the invitation to join you all here today. This talk draws from my new book on predatory data, and for it, I want to begin here with a proposition. What would it mean to narrate the origins of our contemporary data economy, not with the conventional knowledge centers and academic and industry vanguards that have dominated explanations of our present information age, but at another kind of temporal setting, that of the racialized datification fever that fed the rise of what was arguably the 20th century's first popular, globally expansive information movement, when eugenic ambitions aimed to provide universal methods for predicting human fitness. And when eugenic researchers, anxiously facing globalization's modern advent and growing independence struggles around the world, seeded a cross-continental movement to monitor unfitness and remake society in the image of white Western elites over a century ago. To suggest that we expand the means by which we locate the origins of our contemporary data economy around eugenics, violently segregationist disinformation age, is not only decenter the dominant narrative of the technological present from its familiar cast of Western technological heroes, so-called genius male disruptors and enterprise-seeking rebels that have been popularly celebrated as daring visionaries of a new computational future, it's to give name to its explicitly race, gendered, classed, and geopolitical predations that, even when largely unspoken, have laid long and deep at its very foundations. And as I argue too in my new book, to recognize eugenics as a forerunner to contemporary forms of predatory data draws attention too to how the targeted monitoring and surveillance of minoritized populations have not been merely incidental outcomes of data economies. They have been rather essential components of dispossessive and profit-generating knowledge regimes that demanded the continuous profiling of populations. Indeed, from their earliest efforts, eugenicists targeted minoritized populations to generate the excess of data that conditioned the rise of a new global class of information elites. Eugenic hierarchies, that is, grew by expanding global information architectures to monitor and assess human populations and to differentiate so-called deserving classes from the physically, morally, and mentally unfit. This project underscores then how eugenic researchers enthusiastically channeled their ambitions through the frenzied development of varied new data methods and instruments for identifying and predicting degeneracy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These included, as this talk will underscore, intelligence metrics and IQ exams to predict poverty and underproductivity, as much as future cognitive exceptionality. Far from assuming eugenics' disappearance following World War II, this talk will proceed in three parts, tracing an arc from eugenics to what I argue is contemporary techno-eugenics, exploring how eugenic logics are inseparable from data-driven technologies behind today's information economy. So part one of this talk revisits the history of eugenic intelligence prediction, unpacking how its use as an instrument for political stratification endures in knowledge economy frameworks promoted by techno-elites today. Underscoring how the spread of a eugenic disinformation age had been diagnosed generations before, however, part two of this talk explores how eugenic research has long been contested by immigrant and feminist alliances around data, including ones that emerged in the late 19th century. And returning to the present, part three draws from that legacy of data pluralist methods that justice-based actors continue to cultivate today, suggesting strategies for countering AI's eugenic stratifications and monofuturism through a defense of what I'll stress as improbable worlds. So with that, let me begin with part one. Nearly a century after US eugenicists popularized IQ tests as a new metrics to empiricize intelligence and predict future value, a celebration of cognitive elites was being revived in new millennial discourse around the knowledge economy. Defined by a shift away from the manual labor of an earlier industrial age, The knowledge economy was framed in the mainstream press and academy of the 1990s as driven by a new class of intellectual workers who were heralded as engines behind a surge in technological innovation and wealth creation. Such framings, however, also relied on a revival of eugenic models of social hierarchy built around the supposed objectivity of intelligence prediction and the myth of the outsized merit and production and productivity of cognitive elites. These myths around merit and metrics helped to give rise to what I argue has been a new techno-eugenics driven by Silicon Valley elites who today wage campaigns against supposedly regressive democratic norms and their protection of inferior races. By wastefully undermining the superior productivity and revolutionary potential of cognitive elites, techno-eugenicists allege that democratic policies today have produced nothing less than an existential threat to technology and the fate of the entire Western world with it. Nothing better exemplifies this eugenic revival, however, at the dawn of the new millennium's digital age than the controversial popularity of the 1994 publication, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. Selling some 400,000 copies in its first 2 months after publication, the text's overnight best-selling status sent its eugenic arguments into the headlines of nearly every major US news outlet, from the New York Times to Good Morning America. Written for a popular audience by longtime conservative and libertarian authors Richard Herrnstein, a Harvard University psychologist, and Charles Murray, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, the text infamously set off a pitched national debate by leveraging hundreds of pages of data to reassert a biological, racialized basis for intelligence, correlating individual achievement and socioeconomic success with hereditarily determined IQ measures. Across 800 pages, replete with tables, graphs, and data on IQ, the authors argued that the US's most pressing economic and social problems could be empirically traced to questions of intelligence and to problems of both overinvesting in populations with lower IQs through things like public education, for instance, and to nationally disinvesting in gifted populations. They stressed, too, rising demands for skills of a cognitive elite who they argued were best suited to meet the needs for more complex labor in an evolving economy where, quote, the manipulation of information would now be central. Broadly decrying welfare, education, and immigration policies that supported minorities and the poor and that drew resources away from the merit-certified elite, the authors asserted an empirical truth to inequality and accused US policymakers of creating a national disaster by trying to correct natural hierarchy through democratic policies. By their assertion, quote, inequality is a reality and it is time for America once again to try living with inequality, end quote. The once again they referred to, of course, was a winking reference to the eugenic roots of their argument and to the powerful influence Western eugenic researchers once held over national policies and popular culture a century ago. The Bell Curve's introduction then also framed its text in light of the work of Sir Francis Galton, the British biostatistician credited with founding eugenics' global movement in the late 19th century. For decades, Galton worked to find an empirical basis and science of social hierarchy by creating a metrics of human physical, mental, and moral fitness. In contexts like the US, eugenics gained political prominence by growing research architectures and methods to informatically monitor and assess human populations and to differentiate so-called worthy classes from the physically, morally, and mentally unfit. Eugenic researchers based everywhere from Harvard to Stanford and Galton's own University College London enthusiastically channeled their ambitions through the development of varied new data methods, population monitoring techniques, and instruments for predicting degeneracy from the late 19th century onward. This included biometric databases for criminals and immigrants, composite portraiture to predict behavior, morality, and genetic surveys of broadly defined dysgenic classes, and indeed IQ exams and literacy evaluations for immigrants and the poor. Their data work, amplified through US institutions like the Cold Spring Harbor-funded Eugenics Record Office, the American Eugenics Society, and the American Breeders Association, allowed their arguments to spread for the broad monitoring and suspension of basic rights of supposedly genetically contaminating minority populations. Asserting that the proximity and freedom of the unfit would threaten the survival of more worthy classes, US eugenicists' work would see to the popularization of the notion of race suicide, and they saw too to the passage of historic acts in the US over a century ago from immigrant exclusion laws to quotas to favor so-called Nordic races, and the eventual passage of laws to forcibly sterilize the unfit that disproportionately impacted poor, Black, brown, and indigenous women in over 30 US states. It was their data-driven practices, I stress here though, that allowed eugenicists to be so successful in counteracting democratic norms and in arguing that their socially stratifying mission was fundamentally evaluative rather than political. Their normalization of predictive uses of IQ and intelligence tests to promote the segregation of a cognitive elite from degrading populations, thus exemplified, as with other historic policy gains around immigration and sterilization, the efficacy of using data, however questionably derived, to reveal the real truth of human inequality. US psychologist and eugenicist Henry Goddard, who first introduced the term moron in medicine to establish a multi-tiered classification for the feeble-minded, infamously popularized the use of intelligence testing in the US after translating early French tests into English from Binet in 1908. With fellow eugenicists, he strove to prove low intelligence as the primary indicator of deficient self-control, criminality, alcoholism, laziness, prostitution, and even political dissent that would inevitably demand expensive state investments to counteract. He thus advocated intelligence testing for all US immigrants to exclude unfit arrivals, and would seed an intelligence testing industry in the US after distributing copies of his tests, more than 88,000 of translated and self-designed tests of his, to schools, immigration offices, and other public institutions. Among the questions, all to be administered in English, that he added to assess arriving immigrants were, what is Crisco, the US-made cooking product? And who is Christy Mathewson, a US football player? And this is just an image from the front page of the newspaper, the Washington Evening Star from 1913, to really just sort of underscore how eugenicists were by no means sort of like a fringe, right, sort of cultural phenomena. They were already making front page headlines in the news, and certainly were part of a kind of popular conversation we can get more into in discussion. After deploying the tests at Ellis Island, Goddard argued that 80% of non-Nordic immigrants were feeble-minded. The data he collected was credited too with the passage of the historic 1917 U.S. Immigration Act, the first bill that introduced quotas for all immigrants, and that specifically aimed to prevent the entry of so-called non-Nordic races into the U.S. More than half a century later, it was such segregationist games in eugenic data that the bell curve's best-selling authors suggested a return to, and that they defended in a revival of racialized hereditary intelligence models. Many pondered how eugenic arguments had reemerged in the 1990s with such force, but Herrnstein and Murray, the authors, were clear about the resonances they saw between their text and the heightening imperatives of a new knowledge economy. As they wrote, highlighting the demands for new skills of the cognitive elite, quote, today's technological frontier is more complex than ever, with labor less efficiently performed by non-cognitive elites. Moreover, they wrote, the link between IQ and productivity, quote, goes deep. A smarter employee is on average a more proficient employee. And they lamented US laws forbidding of intelligence-based hiring, recommending that, quote, an economy that lets employers pick applicants with the highest IQ is a significantly more efficient economy, end quote. While a pitched debate ensued across mainstream and scholarly circles, absent from the dissent were leading academic voices related to knowledge economy frameworks, and especially the tech sector actors celebrated as emblematic of cognitive elites. Their silence on the matter seemed to channel an endorsement of the distinction they were given and the basis in merit and objective intelligence it was argued to rely upon across Silicon Valley. Instead, vocal advocates such as the venture capitalist Peter Thiel, the libertarian and billionaire co-founder of PayPal and Palantir Technologies, argued that there were heightened stakes to empowering cognitive elites in the new economy, stressing the existential imperative of industry innovation that they drove. Channeling techno-eugenic anxieties, Thiel further fanned contempt for democratic and welfare states. By 2009, he began to publicly speak and publish on the threat of government regulations and anti-discrimination policies as wastefully supporting regressed populations and blocking industry innovations that will lead to economic degeneration, as he called it. Asserting his realization that democracy and freedom are no longer compatible, He'd write in this essay at from the Cato Institute blog that technology and politics are instead, in quote, a deadly race where the fate of our world now depends on the efforts of a single person who builds the machinery of freedom to make the world safe for capitalism, end quote. Thiel, by 2016, of course, was funding US MAGA candidates and Donald Trump to the loud applause of Republican National Convention attendees. And he's also credited with first seeding Silicon Valley's infamous move fast and break things ideology that insists that technological progress should be pursued relentlessly with little, if any, regard for potential costs to society or dangers to society. Notably, too, despite Thiel's clear techno-eugenic overtones, his obsession with empowering a cognitive elite has earned him countless devotees in Silicon Valley and around the world. The depth of his influence can be seen in his enduring role as a mentor and leader in Silicon Valley's so-called PayPal Mafia, an exclusive network of tech elite engineers and capitalists that includes Elon Musk and the founders and investors of YouTube, Yelp, LinkedIn, Facebook, Airbnb, Lyft, Spotify, and Google's DeepMind, among others. Such continuing recruitments can make techno-eugenic expansions throughout the data economy sound unstoppable, but I would be remiss to not mention that alternative data strategies have long been cultivated in distinction to eugenic research methods, including by social justice actors from over a century ago. And so for the second part of this talk, I take inspiration from the data work of past generations of feminist and immigrant organizers, whose work recalls for us the long histories of intersectional feminist and collaborative data practice, ones with roots in spaces beyond tech industry corridors and startups. More than 100 years ago, feminist data researchers were posing critical questions around gender, power, and data practice, and challenging the standard epistemological frameworks and infrastructures by which knowledge and data on marginalized communities in particular was fostered, so that distinct infrastructures could emerge otherwise. The famed Hull House Project, located in Chicago's multi-ethnic West Side, was founded then by feminist advocates Jane Addams and her partner Ellen Gates Starr in 1889 as one such effort. Many might remember its leading role in the US settlement house movement, which by 1910 had grown to over 400 sites that addressed the growing exploitations of urban labor and housing. Hull House, though, also came to be known for its unique success in advancing such key legal reforms in the US as the 8-hour workday, minimum wage, and outlawing child labor. And it was also a hub for prototyping various approaches to social science and community research that championed a new ethical paradigm emphasizing social justice, and that counter-dominant ideas of the era that saw poverty as a result of individual failing and eugenically determined racialized heredity. Part of this involved Hull House's design that blended a community center with an educational campus in Chicago's West Side, where local families, largely immigrants and ethnic minorities, could access classrooms and libraries for free courses, kindergarten, and daycare, theaters and art studios, gyms and athletic programs, and a coffee house and meeting rooms that remained open to the working families and publics of Chicago's 19th Ward. But it also had to do with the novel approaches to research undertaken by residents at the Hull House to document local labor conditions. Hull House Maps and Papers, published in 1895, was an exemplar and quickly placed it at the forefront of new data collection output techniques new data collection and output techniques that would later establish fields from urban sociology to social work. Composed of essays by 10 authors, 8 of which were women, 3 of whom identified as youth immigrants, and only 2 of whom had university training in social sciences, the Hull House volume opened with a modest preface by Jane Addams, who cited the color-coded wage maps of London published by Charles Booth in 1886 as an inspiration. But Hull House's Maps and Papers volume also featured the use of pluralistic data, incorporating surveys and statistics alongside qualitative data and direct testimony from 19th Ward residents. All this to newly capture how gender, ethnicity, and age impacted the lives of working residents and families. Modeling how such added context could powerfully impact research and visualization work, the Maps and Papers volume prompted many later surveys in the 19th Ward, including those that leading sociology departments, such as the University of Chicago's, would later come to be known for. Chapters on Chicago's sweating system, wage-earning children, and cloak makers' expenditures joined others on Czech and Italian community life and the settlement's impact on the labor movement. Details on the daily conditions of life, from the lack of air, light, and space in tenements to the complex rotations of work and sleep families maintained for labor, were paired with empirical, but until then largely unseen, data on the economic system of Chicago sweatshops, the varying wages for stitching hems, for instance, the premature aging of workers, and the deformities and diseases contracted by working children. The color-coded wage maps of the volumes that were paired with the essays further put Hull House's multi-method approaches on display. Co-produced by Alice Holbrook, a student of math and visual arts, and Florence Kelly, a single mother of 3, who was working for the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics when she resided at the Hull House, the maps testified not just to the potential of blending statistical with visual techniques, but to their potentials for challenging and disrupting dominant gender and class bias definitions and classifications for readers. Holbrook and Kelly marked their use of households as the measuring unit for income in their wage maps, for instance, to underscore the essential contributions of women and children to family income in the era. They specified that while readers of the day might find it unusual to see the household category applied to both single wage earners, generally assumed to be men, and to the category of the family head, again assumed to be a father with dependents, Holbrook explained, quote, "In this neighborhood, generally a wife and children are sources of income too. The women wash, do home finishing on clothing, the boys run errands and shine, the girls work in factories or sell papers on streets," end quote. Thus, they argued, the standard practice of treating wives and children as dependents negated their economic contributions. As the authors wrote, quote, "The theory that every man supports his own family is as idle as the fiction that everyone can get work if he wants it," end quote. Hull House's surveys are relevant reminders, too, of the longer legacy of pluralistic research practices that engage the energies of amateurs as well as professional social scientists, and that devoted as much energy to formatting data for experts as for local organizing. By 1895, Hull House and local neighbors were organizing college extension courses that drew hundreds of students, largely young women, and neighbors to classes. It hosted, too, a students' association, several clubs for trade unions and labor organizers, including the Bindery Girls Union and the Men's Typographical Union, both founded at the Hull House, as well as an 8-hour club dedicated to the passage of the Factory and Workshop Bill, a 19th Ward Improvement Club that met with Illinois legislature members, and a Working People's Social Science Club that hosted prominent international activists and researchers for what organizers simply called, quote, "a neighborhood forum for social and economic topics." Such pluralistic data infrastructures made Hull House a generative space for future leaders, with many alum going on to serve in leading roles in diverse history-making organizations, from the NAACP to the ACLU to the Legal Aid, the National Consumers League, the Women's Trade Union League, the National Committee on Child Labor, and the Progressive Party. Its project, I'd argue, too, is a reminder of the legacy of undercredited knowledge work that marginalized populations continue to undertake, often outside the academy, to pluralize research trajectories today. Especially in contemporary Latin America, such work is operated to not only better account for the diverse experiences of lived vulnerability, but to demonstrate how alternative knowledge practices can effectively reset public understandings on such issues as the broad experience of gender-based violence. Efforts surrounding the historic Ni Uno Menos movement have thus been credited with not only amassing some of the largest protests across Latin America, with marches of tens of thousands brought together across diverse ethnic backgrounds, classes, generations, and political affiliations. It's been credited, too, with some of the largest regional data sets on gender-based violence, gathering participants' feedback on a topic notoriously shrouded in silence. In Argentina, such data work emerged through a diverse coalition of feminist organizers who volunteered their labor to design a survey on the topic. The over 60,000 responses they received revealed how expansive the experience of gender-based violence was, with over 97% of respondents reporting that they had suffered some version of it, more than 20% reporting rape, while only 5% said that they had reported anything of that manner to the police. Far from affirming any single monolithic category of gender-based violence, too, organizers stressed how their findings urged the need to pluralize conventional understandings that had been primarily framed around the experiences of women in heteronormative relationships. Alongside the trauma of domestic violence organizers documented in, they stress respondents' feedback too on the violence stemming from discriminatory policies LGBTQ populations face. That from the criminalization of migration or from abortion bans and the lack of access to free healthcare. Channeling a pluralist feminist orientation, Anita Say's work to broaden and reset knowledge around the variable vulnerabilities of gendered lives animates what the decolonial Argentine philosopher Maria Lugones described as a coalitional consciousness. Such an ethic expands modes of relationality between diverse colonized peoples and importantly enables new modes of connection to be fostered between them beyond the terms standardized by dominant colonial knowledge regimes. In the age of big data, decolonial feminist work around data pluralisms also notably serves another function. From Whole House to Ni Uno Menos, their commitments have insisted on alternatives to predatory data infrastructures that have broadly instrumentalized and profited from a reification of dominant knowledge regimes that segment oppressed peoples into discrete categories of gender, class, and race. By decolonial feminist accounts, such divisions not only fail to account for the complex intersectionality threaded throughout oppressed people's lives, they also reify colonial hierarchies and heteronormative worldviews while diffusing other potentialities for solidarity making. Consistently then, decolonial feminist efforts have operated to decenter what we might have presumed to have already settled as given knowns around gender-based dynamics in the real world, particularly in one increasingly defined by big data, where the measure of difference has been used to stabilize and automate gendered and racialized social hierarchies. And so for this final section, I want to explore how decolonial feminists push back on the predatory forms of datification and prediction amplified by AI systems today operate, and how they do this through not just a commitment to data pluralism, but through a defense of what I'll call improbable worlds. I underscore improbability in this final section to contrast with statistically determined forms of likelihood and calculation for probable majority-based outcomes used by AI systems today. Such majority-seeking approaches are commonly used to predict probable outcomes through data processed for the largest possible set of users on platforms, sorting the fullness of activity in the world into predetermined categories in order to achieve scale. Such operations work, too, to keep users blind to other improbabilities, separating populations into a hierarchy of discretely valued classes and classifications, the very work that drove eugenic ambitions across generations. I highlight improbability then to stress statistically minority contexts and conditions that in their existence defy probability and the metrics of scale. Drawing support from unpredictable resources or surprising allies, they can often thrive in probable worlds, that is, in the face of dominant systems. And whether in the emergence of unlikely outcomes, such as the emergence of planet Earth in a universe largely hostile to life, or the thriving of minority communities when dominant forces might condition assimilation, improbable worlds signal the vibrant heterogeneity of being an open possibility across time. This has been harder to notice, however, in a world increasingly defined by AI prediction systems and their amplified projections of probable futures. The prolific real-time recommendations that are channeled through routine interactions for everything from digital identification systems to hiring software, security and navigation technologies to social media and large language models, of course, deliver their predictions and shape a reality intended for the largest volume of processes. In doing so, they activate probable world solutions that bias towards the dominant views and majoritarian outcomes that can be statistically extracted from a data set. And while such systems can provide users with recommendations that appear to be the safest bet, there are many scenarios in which generating probable outcomes for projected futures empirically fails, or have led indeed to a range of deadly injustices. This was the case when the AI system Compass, used by US judges to determine jail sentencing, was found to wrongly overpredict Black individuals and underpredict white individuals' likelihood to repeat committing future crimes in the US. This was the case, too, when students with visual impairments at the University of Illinois were found to be consistently overflagged as cheating by the facial recognition and online proctoring platform Proctorio. There are other scenarios, too, where the desired future is explicitly not the probable outcome. This is true not only in cases of predicting the likely reality for minoritized populations, where data sets are too limited or misrepresentative to accurately project future outcomes, but is also the case in contexts that involve the protection of minoritized value systems, whether racial justice or feminism, where majoritarian populations and values are overrepresented in existing data sets. While such errors are often dismissed by technologists as due to an over or underrepresentation of certain populations in data sets, they fail to acknowledge that when dealing with the fullness of real-world possibilities, as well as the entrenched liabilities of colonial archives and patriarchal datification systems that never fully represented the past, there will always be misaligned data sets. Even when dealing with data sets that aren't mapping human lives, probability-based outcomes have been critiqued for reproducing majoritarian worldviews that extinguished other desired values. AI systems' probabilistic readings of user taste in music, for instance, have led creative producers to critique how such systems have encouraged more formulaic approaches to composition that narrow artistic expression as producers are nudged towards designing for tastes at scale. And as varied other creative potentials get quietly truncated in the meantime. Such increasingly narrow monoculturalist terms for legibility and existence within predictive AI platforms are among the pathologies publics now routinely grapple with as technological design is captured by the majoritarian and probable world terms of techno-eugenicists. This includes not just figures like Peter Thiel, but of course others like Elon Musk, who well before his unprecedented supercharging of authoritarian and white nationalist politics in the US and abroad, and of course his recent still unprompted Nazi salute and follow-up speech before Germany's far-right AfD party, had already been making headlines years earlier for his increasing amplification of white supremacist post and eugenic conspiracy theories on race suicide and replacement theory. And for his predatory relationship with female employees, and his creepy pro-natalist insistence to Silicon Valleyites that, quote, civilization will crumble if we, as in techno-elites, don't have more babies. And so too have his reality-defying outcries of persecution and harm for minorities and anti-discrimination groups who have led him to threaten lawsuits against nonprofits like the Anti-Defamation League for lost revenue and for allegedly seeking to destroy X/Twitter. Likewise, accelerationist movement figures like venture capitalist Mark Andreessen and OpenAI's Sam Altman have garnered attention for large pro-AI fests in Silicon Valley thrown to defend AI against what they've called socialist enemies and what accelerationists have also called deranged regulations that threaten to stagnate a techno-capitalist future and slow the rise of AI's supreme intelligence. Too often, such figures have been treated in mainstream discourse as no more than eccentric tech geniuses with excusably naive or juvenile antics. Or more recently, following Silicon Valley's visible alignment behind the new Trump administration, have been framed as no more than cynically profit-motivated businessmen. But such frames fail to take seriously how such actors dangerously depend on the spread of probable majoritarian values and the active empowerment of dominant classes for AI's growth. Through biasing toward probable outcomes, their prediction systems have provided a means to actively amplify majoritarian worldviews into this future, allowing the overblown anxieties of majoritarian populations, nationalists, and the far-right radicals across the globe to go from fringe to front page virtually overnight. Their forceful denial of charges of racism and indignant defense of their work as invested in either freeing speech or, quote, saving civilization only allow them to deflect accountability for their harms. Moreover, their insistence on the need for continual technological revolution powerfully work to drown out all other alternative paths for future worlding, so much so that to refuse their future virtually means to refuse the future itself. The absurdity of such projections, however, can and should be named as a core symptom of techno-eugenics and its efforts to colonize perceptions of reality through fear-mongering. The repeated claims of persecution by Silicon Valley's most wealthy elites should readily indicate how deeply a pathological drive for self-preservation propel white male techno-elites' claims around insecurity. While attempting to dismiss, it would be a mistake to not take seriously their effect of distracting away from the actual vulnerabilities that have amplified for all other parties around. Being forced to focus on techno-eugenicist survival, that is, means paying less attention to the narrowing terms for survival and support they've created for everybody else. Little wonder that growing publics have called for resistances to such systems and their foreclosing of possibilities for other independent, unprescribed futures. Such refusals remind us that accepting Silicon Valley's techno-eugenic terms is far from inevitable. Actively refusing its probable majoritarian predictions as the most evolved future, however, means something other than quitting platforms. It means renewing feminist and decolonial commitments to other vital futures and defending data pluralism and support for not only diverse systems of knowing beyond techno-eugenic terms, but recognizing the deep damage done when reality and history are framed by the masculinist paradigms of competitive survival, natural hierarchy, and global scarcity. Such frames actively work to foreclose alternative futures, keeping publics frozen in the precarity of self-preservation. Rejecting techno-eugenic frames thus opens possibilities for registering the present and future on new terms altogether. Rather than projecting the wholesale rejection of technology as the only alternative, it engages accounts that underscore the persistent possibility of and deep longing for solidarity and collective vitalities around data pluralisms and technological alternatives that have never been fully captured by techno-eugenics' monoculturalist agenda. To respond to the very temporal orientations of marginalized communities, as feminists and decolonial researchers do, renews commitments to not merely know, but to stay, be, and think with such communities in what STS scholars have called the tempos of care time. Decolonial feminist researchers' defense of improbable worlds thus situates data practice in a temporal order that unfolds outside that of big data's insistence on universality. From such a vantage, datification processes can be read as something other than an abstractive process whose global takeover and grip on the future is already a given. Can be recognized instead as an uneven and locally contingent process that gets differentially shaped across locales by specific forms of resistance and care. From such a vantage, big tech companies and institutions driving AI regimes can now be seen not as decontextualized global forces, but as entities, that is, for which stability relies on sustained coordination still across local sites, where local forms of disruption and dissent can still meaningfully register. This project has issued a call then to listen for, remember, and recall the strategies fostered across generations around feminist data pluralism and its multi-temporal relationalities, and to resist techno-eugenicist false insistence on a revolution imperative with its percussive singular drive for control and profit as supposedly the highest aim of technology and the only path to future making. This is a call to foster a closer recognition of the interconnective cultivations data pluralists brought forth across generations. Such critical reorientations center the experiences, perspectives, and storytelling of marginalized populations, and in doing so, advance new frameworks in defense of improbable worlds. These include calls for the abolishment of big data abolishment of big data that I'm crediting here to organizations like Data for Black Lives and Data Sovereignty, that here I'm crediting to the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, a sort of new language to frame big data conversation around, as well as counter data practices that the Datos contra el Feminicidio, Data Against Feminicide Network has cultivated, and Data Bodies Defense, that Our Data Bodies Collective, the Detroit Community Technology Project, the Los Angeles Community Action Network as well have been working around, anti-spying discourse from the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, Mi Gente as well, and collective benefit that organizations like the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty organization and group have been behind. As forms of situated data practice, the local data encounters these projects entail recognize the need for fostering variated modes of seeing to challenge unlocatable and unaccountable modes of knowledge practice. They also reveal the inherent multiplicity of potentials for interpretation that surrounds any data set that users are often encouraged to only see as given and predetermined by probability. Such commitments to improbable worlds remind us that dislodging our contemporary imaginaries around AI and data-driven economies and their singular focus on privileged sites of high innovation is long overdue. Such fixations have artificially kept public's focus on operations taking place inside the exclusive site of Silicon Valley firms and research campuses. The outsized attention given to the exceptionality and speed and scale that publics have repeatedly been told such sites process have framed them as the digital age's highest achievement. And they have only reified probable world castings around data and AI. In doing so, they draw attentions away from the invisibilized work of repair and restoration necessary to contend with the global ecologies of exclusion and predation that big tech firms have also accelerated. We need to reject such distractions and empower new imaginaries, including ones around improbable worlds, around global technologies and society that are not driven by the survivalist fantasies and paranoid self-preservationist anxieties of white westernized techno-elites. The call here to think across time and space reminds us how much work has already been and continues to be committed to reclaim the aims of pluralistic solidarity, restoration, and repair that diverse marginalized communities have cultivated in data work all around the world. Other forms of global knowledge futures have long been imagined. How to see ourselves in relationship to them and decenter technology's deadly master narrative in the name of new solidarities is a challenge of improbable world building we're invited to step into. So thank you.
Thank you, Anita, for that amazing weaving together of all aspects of your wonderful new book, Predatory Data. I hope all of you get a chance to read it. It is open access. Actually, you can read it open access online, so it is accessible. So we're going to start the moderated discussion portion of this event. And so I'm going to start out with a few questions, but we have some microphones going around. So Montserrat, raise your hand. There's one microphone there, or she will have one soon. Jane over there will have another microphone. So raise your hands and folks will come around with questions. While that microphone is making its way, I see some hands going up over here. I want to begin with just a question to launch us. And Youngman has helped me put together some questions for you. You outlined some remarkable ways in which current forms of technology are reinforcing, creating systemic inequalities, whether it's the hiring programs or so many different ways. And you provide us with some potential ways to counter that through decolonial approaches. But before moving to questions on the decolonial approaches, are there ways that we can hold tech companies more accountable? Are there ways that we or policymakers or other private interests tell us what can we do? Sometimes you can feel pretty powerless.
Absolutely. I think a couple of things. It is not to stop using technology, as I mentioned. If anything, it's to really ground our critique and to support, of course, the kinds of things that we're seeing in terms of trying to hold tech companies accountable now. So one thing I will first mention is just in terms of us being we're at an academic institution now. We're at a public R1 research university. One of the sort of first ways that we have the power to be able to push back as faculty members, as researchers, as students, is to demand more in terms of what our universities and institutions are cultivating in terms of data science programs that have been largely designed and geared towards feeding a tech economy. Even the language of data science itself, I mean, there are any number of alternative frames that may have been developed to think about or talk about that practice. Data science itself was derived directly from industry. It's their term for really thinking about what it is, how to kind of classify this kind of new work of essentially predicting audiences, not exactly a science, but what they'd like to frame it to sort of give it that sort of professional thrust. And by and large, they have not included classes in humanities, critical social sciences. When social sciences are included, it tends to be econ and stats or statistics. They look different across every campus. So in different campuses as well, there are kinds of drawing upon various threads, but generally they tend to, if they are, when versions of social sciences are included, it's quant-based methodologies, rather than thinking much more pluralistically about data. When ethics classes are included in such programs, they tend to be one course, not something that's actually streamlined and threaded fundamentally throughout all courses, such that when we're thinking about the uses of statistical regression, right? I mean, that is exactly the methodology that is derived from Sir Francis Galton, right? Sir cousin of Charles Darwin, and it's completely removed from any form of historicity. You would almost never think, when we think about the kind of import, let's say, of anthropology in the colonial era, right? And fast forward 100 years to imagine that we not be trained as anthropologists or ethnographers in the history of our own field, particularly when it had such a sort of dark root in terms of the empowerment of colonial regimes and data gathering for that effort. You almost can't imagine it. And but there is much of my motivation really for writing the book was finding myself in an information science school, wanting to have a conversation with my students about the sort of history of racialized practices that they were literally sort of being trained in on a day-to-day to sort of build their new professional identities, and really being removed from any kind of historical context or literacy around that. We can demand more, but I will also say that there are any number of different sorts of local efforts as well that are going on that look different, of course, per city, that are attempts to speak back at collectively what we see in terms of tech sector leadership, whether it is protests at Tesla or a science march that's happening tomorrow that really is not just a call for collective presence, but really a way to vocalize a speaking back to in a moment where literally we're seeing a kind of attempt to really sort of chill speech and the notion of what counts as civil speech, so-called civil speech. But you certainly see any number of different efforts being organized. The last thing I'll say, just because I think it's one thing that I've noticed happening in my local community, which is I'm coming from Urbana-Champaign and college town that's about a third of the size of Minneapolis, St. Paul. In this sort of moment of new anxiety and distress again around access, government and state-based access to data on vulnerable populations, who has that data readily available, et cetera. There have been any number of different local efforts to try and create new forms of local legislations to underscore the need for public oversight around the growth of surveillance technologies, especially by law enforcement. In my own local community, there's been a local bill that's been proposed and that's gotten going through the channels of reformulation and public debate. And it really was a coalition of different forms of organizations, from privacy rights organizations to civil rights groups to racial justice groups, coming together really to have this multi-sectoral conversation really on what the implications were of the growth of technology, of surveillance technologies in the hands of law enforcement, even local law enforcement that in the state of Illinois as a blue state, wants to make promises to state-based constituents that there are protections, civil protections against federal data sharing. I think there's now really a kind of skepticism around that. And again, new efforts then to sort of try and think through what is necessary in terms of state-based, the balance between state-based interest in securing publics and this kind of now amplification of very powerful new surveillance technologies across public spaces that was definitely not the mode of law enforcement, let's say, a decade ago.
Questions in the audience? I think there was one here, right? Or do you have it already? Oh, great. I was looking for the mic.
Yes.
On the subject of accountability, would you consider having, individuals or even workplaces, other institutions start to change their products, the products that they're using? Like, for example, changing what browsers we're using, or, what search engines we're using, what apps we're using, stuff like that? Or should we even start to try to make a greater effort to diversify what products we're using at the very least?
Yeah. I mean, That's certainly, I would say that's certainly sort of, you know, a real thing to consider, obviously. I will say though, I almost never give a sort of never do X, including, I mean, you know, I'm almost tempted to say just get off of X and just delete all forms of, but we have researchers still there. And I have students of mine who are following as well, you know, the growth of nationalisms and the articulations of that, the global growth of that. And for research purposes, I'm really, you know, again, sort of rather than sort of trying to make a blanket recommendation for what not to do, I think about instead how to use it well, how to use it wisely, how to do it in a kind of justice-based effort, and to certainly empower the conversations around what findings are from those platforms, because the record over and over again shows that the eugenicists have always lied. I mean, it has always been a disinformation age. So everything that's happening in terms of like Doja's claims and its attempts to sort of datify and then create all those visualizations, like here's the amount of money that we spent and then, or that we saved, and then, oh yeah, oops, sorry, it wasn't exactly that. When it was so obvious to any sort of entry-level government worker that like literally click through the receipt and add up you know, your accounts. In any case, none of that was difficult. None of that required any kind of genuine expertise. It was really very much a kind of an attempt to demonstrate, I think most of us would know that rather than any genuine assessment, there was politics at work there, right? But that was always the case, even with eugenicists from over, you know, from a century ago, where over and over again, in order to make their kinds of policy claims and to be able to scale into the public imaginary in the way that they did, they had to doctor the data. So, I mean, I gave the example of Goddard's use of the IQ exams, right, that were administered in English, that were included questions that, you know, native-born, quote unquote, native-born Americans would have had a hard time answering, you know, and administering them, you know, in English to new arrivals. I mean, really designed to essentially get the data that he was looking for. But any number, you know, the Kalanick family publication that was a bestseller of the time that was meant to demonstrate how unfitness, a eugenic publication of the time that was meant to argue and demonstrate empirically how unfitness passed along through the generations, right? Poverty, pauperism, alcoholism, proclivities to laziness, right? This was tracking the Kalanick family. The volume was, but the photos were infamously doctored over and over again, and some of them aren't even like not obviously doctored; they look doctored, and yet it was a best-selling publication of its day and managed to really empower an argument for, as Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., you know, would famously state in his, he was a Supreme Court judge who oversaw the 1927 Buck versus Bell case that maintained the legal status of forced sterilization of the unfit in the US. He was a famed eugenicist, and as he would put it, 3 generations of unfitness is enough, of feeble-mindedness is enough. In other words, like for their minds, in their minds already, the data was enough to actually, again, lean into these kinds of large-scale policy decisions, despite the fact that it was doctored and disinformation from the beginning.
I think we have another question over here.
Can I? Okay. Hi. Well, thank you so much for the talk. I have a question in regard to some of the context that you pointed in your book, like you pointed to the Facebook and Twitter in India talking about religious and class division and the way it amplified racial division in other countries. What's your opinion when you want to talk about big tech and its effect in transnational, international context?
It is super imperative. I mean, I think our blind spot for not having a much more global conversation around what data is doing and the kind of data economies that we've grown transnationally and how much big tech has really relied upon experimentation in different sites to sort of figure out its models and also to economize its models. So I open up the book with the case of India in large part because it became really part of a larger conversation in the West following the 2019 release of the Francis Haugen papers, and a kind of then awakening of just how much even Facebook's own workers were astonished by the rapidity of which right-wing nationalism just was exploding across the platform, and how within just a few months, opening any account, just sort of letting it just watching it kind of unfold as a sort of test account of a user, a generic female user in northern India. Let's see what happens within 3 months of use. Within a month, they were already seeing it flooded with nationalist hate speech. And that in large part is because of some of the sort of numbers that we'd already seen in terms of social media companies of the day. This is prior to 2019. So even then, it was 84% of Facebook's safety and security investments. So basically trying to tap down on disinformation and versions of hate speech that can get associated with disinformation right across global publics. 84% of that was only used on on US-based publics. And the rest of the world was 16% of that. So in contexts like India and other places like Myanmar, where there were literally already explosions of xenophobic hate. In India, the case is super interesting because in the US, there was some following of that case. It wasn't consistent and coherent, but you would see reporting, in the New York Times about Google workers that were being attacked randomly in a village. And much of that was, and it would talk about, the article would go on to sort of talk about how a lot of that was because of disinformation that had spread on social media platforms. A worker or someone who looks unknown goes into a local area, some sort of rumor starts to spread that this person is here to convert our wives and kidnap our children and then convert our children as a Muslim. None of this being true, but nonetheless, at any range of different kinds of violence, there were victims as young as 12 years old that nonprofit and human rights organizations were documenting to Google workers, and any number of just sort of, unassuming passersby. But there were any number of different cases of this sort of exploding leading up to the 2019s. And the case of Myanmar, of course, is well documented by 2016, that there was already a kind of an ethnic genocide happening. And that official UN reports were documenting how the role of social media, and especially Facebook, and the explosion, the use of social media by nationalist parties and by ruling parties really as means to foster populism and to gain some political groundswell, but the targeting of minoritized populations in order to do that. All of that was already sort of documented and well known by Facebook by 2019. And so that was, so the astonishment was really, if this is not just, oh, we're just finding this out for the first time, if in fact this had been a known issue, what it does, what it means to get rid of safety and security, and essentially adjudicate that there are some populations that don't deserve security, that there are some populations that do, where it's worth making some version of investment in, there are some versions of the world that don't. That's the experiment that we saw, and it wasn't, it certainly was not an unknown of what what would come out of that. And so when Mark Zuckerberg is announcing, that they are going to essentially disinvest in their safety and security teams and disinformation teams, right? That was the recent announcement, and that by March, we will see a very different kind. By this month, we will see a very different kind of Facebook. It's not an unknown. It's not just a kind of question mark. I think they have a sense of where this is going to go.
We'll take a question over there.
Hi. So as DOGE consumes and digests federal data across multiple agencies, some of the concerns I have are, as AI delves into that, first, there's operational data about the American government that may be sensitive, intelligence data.
Yes.
Then there's federal worker to be targeted, or federal worker data, and civilian or regular American data that is vulnerable. There's already been some anecdotal news about people being fired because they were part of employee resource groups and queer, and talking about it on any chat or email. And so I just wonder, I know you can't see the future, but what risks you see as far as that targeting of the United States's data and AI being able to really delve into that and cross-agency reference?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a question, this is still early days, and it's a question really of how we push back. I think the ease by which the things seem to be happening is in part because they are in a sort of move fast and break things mode, and because there is some sort of patience, like some version of like a tolerance for just sort of seeing whether or not from a public that doesn't yet have a negative impression of DOGE, right? So people who have either voted for the Republican Party or we're sort of in that independent sort of space, it's already starting to give. So you can certainly see already, obviously in sort of the town hall videos that are now getting passed around, attempts to sort of really quash that kind of critique and to try and shut down having town halls altogether. But I do see it as a kind of A/B test on the American public to see how far they can go with things before they get a kind of reaction. Eugenics was always sort of that way. It was a kind of attempt to take a temperature gauge to see how far they could go. Eugenics didn't overnight, pass 30 sterilization laws. It was a groundswell, and it started first, with the first forms of legislation in the US, which were tests of essentially, again, American appetites, and they used essentially othered populations. So they use China in the first, Immigration Exclusion Act in 1875, the Page Act, which was targeted against Asian American women, supposedly for the bad blood that they were bringing in that was contaminating well-born white families and populations with syphilis and moral weakness and criminality. It expanded in 1888 to Chinese men, but also dissidents and feeble-minded populations. So again, sort of gradually expanding. And then by 1917 and 1924 had grown much more expansively to include Latinx, African, but famously Southern, Eastern, and Jewish populations, again, to sort of privilege, as the language put it, Nordic classes. But it was a gradual sort of test over and over again to see where they could get some sort of gain in terms of scaring American publics and convincing them that this was the only mode to gaining some version of security. So in this case, over and over again, what you hear is that if we don't create this kind of efficiency, if we don't do this, government is going to collapse, which is crazy, crazy because it's literally at their own hands and fingertips. And so, but it is a kind of test to see like what kind of reaction we'll have. And I think that's essentially like seeing the kind of pushback and swell. They're having to essentially react in terms of then re-strategizing, like maybe we won't have town halls any longer. So I do think that we're in this kind of A/B testing mode again.
We have a question over on this side. Chip?
Thank you very much, Anand. This is a fantastic talk. We say that technology is not neutral, somehow it's a social product. And then we can say that gender is a social product when we see the artificial intelligence, so Silicon Valley allies control. In other words, it's a white man control by it, right? And who code is matter, how we code is matter. Yes, but my question is, like when we see these codes are coded by the English. English is a monolanguage. And then it is centered like English and also centered Western epistemology. So if this language is the monolanguage, how can we imagine for the future this technology can shape the society and gender dynamic in an inclusive way?
I mean, in part, that's why I point to examples like the Hell House, because it really was a space where new immigrants and new English speakers were really kind of working in collaboration and coalition together. They were bringing sort of different skill sets to the table in order to both collect data, but also to analyze and speak for it and to account for what they were seeing and sort of thinking cross-disciplinarily, I would argue, and geographically, cross-nationally in many ways. It's why, again, when we think about the kinds of data science programs we want, co-thinking together across disciplines and not just through a single discipline, right? Like, why is it problematic to see a population only through, let's say, how Amazon or how Google might know you? Like, why is it that that profile is actually not, it's one version of it, it's not the fullness of you? And why is it that what is the limitedness of that kind of understanding and snapshot? What happens when we start to sort of, again, just imagine that a kind of data trail that someone may leave behind is the fullness of, let's say, what an adjudication on criminality or something else might be based upon, or whether or not they're able to, be admitted into, like in a hiring application, right? Whether or not they should be admitted into a kind of, into a job pool. Like, why is it that that kind of snapshot and that limited version of data that is going to come in and get assessed quantitatively and numerically, what is the basis for that sort of assessment? So just to underscore again that, thinking through and having the kinds of conversations we would have with, quant-based trained and STEM-based students alongside other forms of seeing and working with data. I think so many of the sort of general errors that we see in both large language model applications, but also even just in some of the kinds of examples I was giving here, would never have been produced. I mean, so, I put up a snapshot of some of the studies around gender-based prediction. Was a famous study that folks might have remembered that was drawn from a study of essentially dating platform and trying to essentially predict from that data whether or not the users were gay or straight, and using essentially the data that was included on the profiles of users to do this sort of predictive modeling and to assess whether or not gender could be predicted. Of course, I mean, as you could see in my screenshots and capturing of some of the data from that publication, quite controversial publication. I mean, even that model was using a kind of binary of gender, which again, any simple conversation, maybe it's not so simple. I shouldn't point it as simple because actually it's really hard to have some of these interdisciplinary conversations, but a different kind of obviously decision making that shouldn't be rocket science to just get to actually read and see data together and have a different kind of conversation around how things are assessed, because these are, I mean, again, powerful forms of design that sometimes literally 20-year-old data scientists with very little exposure to an outside conversation. Sometimes they're not terribly meaning, but they are very dangerously siloed in a single model for how to see the world.
So maybe I'd like to follow up on that question and thinking about ways in which to have alternative decolonial approaches. You have some on-the-ground experience. You talk about some of it in one of your chapters on community data initiatives. And then you have a data clinic, right?
Yes,
A community data clinic.
Yeah.
And you're part of the Feminist Data Manifest No project.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about these projects
Yeah.
that you're engaged in and how they can be
Yeah.
a potential
Yeah.
answer
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
resisting big tech.
Yeah, they're interdisciplinary is one thing. I mean, for one of them, for instance, for the data clinic, we do a number of different things. So we collaborate with several local organizations and social service organizations as data organizations. These are organizations that oftentimes aren't working. They work in poverty relief in Champaign County in East Central Illinois, and aren't oftentimes thought of as in terms of as organizations that do data work, or that are even thought of as doing knowledge work, because they're so framed as doing poverty relief instead. But in fact, these are the organizations that when you give them, records of what technology use looks like across Champaign County, or when you simply ask them, what is the poverty rate in Champaign County versus anywhere else across the state or versus nationally, they absolutely know and have a much sort of more granular literacy than your average information scientist at the University of Illinois. The answer is that our poverty rate locally in Champaign County is actually almost double what it is across the state of Illinois, and almost double what it is across the nation. But you wouldn't have that impression if you only lived and sort of spent your life kind of working on a campus where tech resources are ample and plentiful, and where the kinds of divides around technology and class just aren't articulated on a regular and a day-to-day basis. And these are organizations that sort of have worked for a long time around thinking through how to actually bridge some of those technological divides, working around that broadband equity projects. And so we do a lot of support work with them and allow them really to sort of design the deliverables for what they want our lab to get to empower. A lot of times it's curriculum around digital literacy that doesn't look like, it's not just about how to use a VPN. The kind of digital literacy that they're really sort of interested are forms really of connecting local citizens to various forms of civic resources that have become increasingly digitized and that are that have become harder and harder for many families to access. So in some ways, it's sort of spotlighting those resources, sort of giving a primer on like what does qualification look like, how to kind of ease on-ramps for access, and to sort of spotlight, here are places where free tax resources, low to free educational and higher ed resources if you're trying to finish a degree, finish high school, et cetera. I mean, there are things that in any case, yeah, the deliverables, I will say, are designed primarily by our partners rather than by the sort of goals of information of fellow colleagues and academics like myself. I really sort of cede the ground to our partners to do that design work. The other thing we do is under the clinic is teach and model interdisciplinary teaching. So we have classes that are co-taught by myself and a computer scientist and a historian around mixed methods that really sort of walks through what it means to engage information scientists and young computer scientists, like getting them introduced to archives, why it is that like material old school archives, whether it's the Babbage Institute, why it's so meaningful, why it looks really different than the way they think about archives as sort of very subjects-based, how human integrity is actually seen and literally through the classification systems that archives at a university would have, rather than sort of just assuming that, if I put in a search term like the Clayball Act, like what would that pull up, and finding any number of different absences when you do a search term like that, which was a kind of act that students protested around at the University of Illinois in the 1960s, and that sort of kicked off the free speech and then anti-Vietnam War movement. But in any case, the sort of absences that you would see when you do searches around even subject terms like that in a search engine, and it's just fascinating to see. And I'll say one other thing, I guess, which is something that I think is really somehow resonant with this generation, which is that they seem to there's a kind of interest and engagement in archives and like material old school archives, I think, in a way that's different from the way that they think about or will engage with online and digital archives, in part because they sort of can see and get that this is hard. These are materials that are actually difficult to digitize and to sort of classify, according to sort of one thing and stabilize under like a kind of one classification system. Like recognizing that the insights that they form when they're visiting the archives, are not something that can be easily replicated in the ChatGPT. That it's something that really feels still to them, I think, quite individual. It's like still some version of ownership over intellectual agency and insight. In any case, yeah, I think that's one of the sort of exercises too. So I would just say that, yeah, spaces like this are really a kind of opportunity for all of us to sort of think through the ways that we can organize, weave.
We have another question here, somewhere over here, right?
Thank you so very much. This is an incredible conversation. I'm thinking about this in the context of being somebody who works for our state government in our public health department.
Yeah.
We collect all kinds of data about people, and it's really, really important to understand suicide, human trafficking, substance use, and who is disproportionately impacted.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're faced with how the data we collect can be weaponized against those communities. And so I'm just really interested in hearing you talk about how people who are in these roles where we're getting this data and we're trying to interpret it and share it back in a responsible way, but we know it can be twisted.
Yeah.
What do we do in response to
Yeah,
that?
I mean, one is, I think like good data practice around this sort of aggregate is use the aggregate, not the individuated forms, but also work alongside critical constituents and stakeholders who represent that community to sort of frame the conversation, allow the conversation to be framed or co-framed by them. So that it's not just sort of like I'm sure that there's some version of this practice that is probably maybe already seeded, but if not, there are any number of civil rights organizations and different organizations that are really happy to have this conversation with public health because it's impacting so many. I mean, it's post-COVID, the kind of literacy and awareness of just how important empowered public health organizations are. Especially the kind of work with diverse populations and the kind of there's a special kind of trust that's different from law enforcement, let's say. And so modeling that relationship and letting that, again, sort of letting that co-design work be and how that community is able, or how various communities are able to shape the conversation alongside you, where that conversation gets to go, whether it's through public schools, it's outreach spaces first, or other kinds of zones. Yeah, but in any case, thank you for your work. And, and thank you also for that question.
I think, do we have any other questions? I think we'll wrap it up because we have some refreshments over here, and we can take some time for a casual conversation, get to know each other, have some informal conversation with Anita, and we do have 4 books for the first 4 students that would like a book and have Professor Chan sign it.
Thanks, everybody, for your questions. That was a really lovely conversation. Thank you, Christina, for your